Well, I'm joined now by Professor Greg Philo from the University of Glasgow, who's done extensive work on role models for children, amongst many other things. Alex Richardson is the Chief Executive and founder of the charity Gladiator, which works with young people in Easterhouse here in Glasgow. And in Edinburgh is Dr. Hugo Gorange, an expert in public order policing from the University of Edinburgh. Well, Alex Richardson, I'm just curious, you work with young people in Easterhouse. I hope they wouldn't find it insulting if I say it's the kind of demographic which we've seen involved in some of the trouble down in England. Are there differences up here, do you think? Do they not have some of the issues which are leading to this, or are they not as opportunistic, is it, as some of what's going down in England?
Well, I mean, not just Easterhouse, but the East End of Glasgow predominantly. There's a long history, mostly of territorial problems. Kids cocooned in their own territories, in their own gangs. We don't have the racing mix that you have just now, or racial tensions that you have. But nonetheless, territoriality is just as lethal. The same thing you have is kids there at the bottom end of society who they don't have any opportunities, they're starved. And worse than that, they have no hope of getting opportunities. The politicians, I've noticed, quite rightly, have spent a lot of time condemning, the riots and all the actions on what's happened down south. But there's very few answers coming back on what's causing the root problems of this and how do you solve it.
Right. Well, you're saying that the youngsters you work with, as far as you can see, I mean, you mentioned the problem of race, for example,
yeah.
but okay, there's a different racial mix here. But
yeah.
although there are certainly a lot of black kids in London have been involved in this, there's not really been any suggestion that it's a result of racial tension as such. So you think that actually the young people you deal with, think the same way, have much the same issues? What?
Well, taking a racial issue to the side, all the other social problems of feeling excluded, lack of opportunities, I believe there's a lot of feelings there with that. And that can manifest. And that's one of the main roles of organisations like my own, is to try and create as many opportunities as possible for young people so that they can life progress, they can character build and hopefully become job ready, if not now, at a later date.
Yeah, yeah. Have you actually talked to any of the kids about what's happening?
Well, clearly the kids that we work with are enjoying the opportunities that we're trying to develop for them.
No, I mean, talk to them about what's happening in London.
Yeah, absolutely. They're as appalled as anybody else. And there's always that danger that for every kid that's causing trouble, the kid that's not causing trouble is stigmatised in the same way, i.e. you're a young person, you must be a troublemaker. If it was adults that was rioting, would you tar every adult the same brush? You wouldn't. My view, basically, where the failings are going wrong here is this country in the last 2 to 3 years has no sense of itself from top to bottom. One of the things that was mentioned as one of the possible causes I've noticed in the media was the word greed in terms of the looting. Now, greed applies to a lot of levels. When we look at the pillars of society in the last 3 years, we've seen, whacking bonuses with the financial scandals with the banks. We've seen the political scandal, with expenses for MPs. Just recently, you've seen, with News International in terms of phone hacking. Again, caused by greed because people are selling stories.
But is that reasonable, Greg Philo? I mean, there's no particular reason to think that someone who's, in Clapham, nicking a mobile phone out of a shop because they can and thinking this is great fun, is particularly thinking, oh, well, I'm just doing the same because of the News International scandal or MP's expenses or something like that. It doesn't work quite like that, does it?
I think there's a disconnection now between reward and effort. People are seen to be just making piles of money as fast as they possibly can. I think that is being shown to us every day, and all the issues about tax avoidance and the simple making of money.
But do you think the young people who are involved in this are aware of these or thinking about these things?
I think they see a society where they're excluded from and where some people are doing incredibly well. You don't have to be watching the television. I mean, if you're living in London, you can see fabulous wealth next to incredible poverty.
Yeah.
And what has happened in the last 30 years is a free market society where the top 10% and the top 5% have really enriched themselves in an extraordinary way. So you have, like the top 5% have top 10% have £4 trillion worth of personal wealth. I mean, it's incredible wealth.
Okay. Well, Hugo Gorringe, I'm just interested in your perspective on this, partly about who these people are. One of the things that struck me today is that everyone's sitting around having earnest discussions about, the problems of youth in London, particularly the problems of black youth, and, it's about parenting and it's about parental role models and stuff. When you look at the people who are appearing in the magistrates' courts today, you get a rather different picture. You know, there's a guy who was a teaching assistant in a school. There was a guy who was a lifesaver in a swimming pool at a health club. There were lots of students, including several white students. There was a guy who was accused of smashing in a police car. It turned out he was in the 3rd year of a sports degree at Clapham College. They're just not, when you see them in court, looking quite like the image we've maybe projected onto them.
No, not at all. I'd agree with the previous two speakers as well, that if we're talking in terms of social responsibility, then that social responsibility begins at the top as well. And there's been a long period of people abdicating responsibility. In terms of the riots and who's taking part in the rioting and the looting, I think we need to differentiate between why these riots were triggered, what led to them kicking off in the first place, and then those who are taking part more opportunistically because, shops are being trashed because they're passing by, they happen to be in the area, and so on and so forth. And I think studies of riots, both in the UK and in France, extending back to the 1980s, suggest that riots tend to be triggered where there are populations suffering from forms of economic deprivation and where there is a history of antipathy with the police.
Right, okay. So the trouble with that, Greg Philo, is that, again, I'm coming back to the people who've been appearing in court, which prompts the
media will pick the odd ones, won't they? You have 5,000 people in court, the media are going to pick the teaching assistant, aren't they? That's what they're going to do.
I accept that, but it does provoke the awful thought that maybe the people doing this aren't uneducated. Maybe the people who are doing this aren't illiterate as they've been described.
Well, then that would fit in with what we've just said, in which case they might well be saying, well, why should all the bankers get all the money? And, so you're...
Well, Gordon, I'd like to say that this current generation of youths are remarkably well informed compared to their predecessors through the wonders of the social media and the internet these days. They're more shrewd of what's going on in terms of politics and everything else than they've ever been in the past. 1 in 4 young people between the ages of 16 and 24 are currently unemployed in this country and growing. Now,
but when you say they're more aware of politics and the things that Greg was talking about, inequality and stuff, what do you mean by that? What sort of things do they talk about when it comes to that?
Well, back to what I was speaking about earlier, the pillars of society at the top over the last 2-3 years that should be the role model to offer hope to people when it's bad enough if you don't have a job. If you don't have if you've no faith in the opportunities coming.
Yeah, I understand that you think that's a problem. What I'm saying to you is that really, are you really telling me that when you go to work with young people in East House, that's what they're saying to you?
We employ 20 young people just now. Now, to give you an example, the average to bail a bank out in this country is 40 billion. If you invested $1 billion in the voluntary sector in just 2 or 3 cities alone in Scotland, the voluntary sector would have every young person off the street working to run projects in their own area, whilst at the same time taking their younger siblings off the street and out of trouble and peer learning them for future employment if there's no employment here just now. Those opportunities don't exist at the bottom level, Gordon.
I understand what you're saying, Alec. What I'm saying to you is I understand that you believe that. What I'm querying is whether the young people in Easter House and other areas of Glasgow that you're working with, are you really saying they're coming to you with some worked-out analysis which tells them that, it's unfair to them because of bankers' salaries and stuff? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is, if you have a more increased general awareness than, say, the youth of your predecessors did, then that can add to the feeling of hopelessness and despair. Why should I bother to stay in the straight and narrow? What chance do I have towing the line and getting somewhere in my life when other people at higher levels are only showing the same moral standards.
All right, Hugo Gorange, I just slightly change this subject to the question of the situation politically and in terms of policing that we're in tonight, because we were getting to the stage, weren't we, where this was almost about state power, not in the sense that there was a revolutionary group wanting to take over society, but where Boris Johnson's London administration, the Metropolitan Police and David Cameron's government had visibly failed to control the capital city of the United Kingdom. Now presumably, from the point of view of any state, you simply cannot allow that to happen.
Well, in a democratic society, it's very difficult to police mass disorder on this scale. The public order tactics are not designed to deal with these numbers of people. We simply do not have enough police officers on the streets to contain, arrest or disperse the numbers of people who have been engaged in the riots across... But
they have to show that they can do that over the next few days, don't they?
Yes, and I think they are beginning to do that. I mean, the tactic of flooding the streets of London with officers seems to have had some impact.
Well, also, interestingly, tonight, there's been a bit of a standoff, as far as we can see, in Eltham in southeast London, between people who are coming out into the streets to defend their property. There have been allegations that the English Defence League, I don't know whether that's true or not, but what's very interesting is that police seem very keen to get them off the streets as well. And presumably, again, if you're the state, having vigilante groups, even though many people would sympathise with people defending their own property, but from the state's point of view, that's almost as dangerous as having the looters out, isn't it? Because it just says you've lost control.
Yes, I mean, it says you've lost control, but it also eats away at the legitimacy of the police. It suggests that they are not in control of the situation and they are not able to differentiate between who is doing what. It was interesting that Sir Hugh Orde wrote a piece in The Guardian this evening suggesting that this was not the time for baton rounds and for water cannon. And his argument was precisely about police legitimacy. And he said that, if we start using more aggressive forms of policing, if we start tolerating forms of vigilantism, then we may win the battle in terms of getting people off the streets, but we lose the war because we lose people's respect, we lose legitimacy and all the implications that have in the long term.
The really big issue here is that the politicians have not grasped that these are still very small numbers of people. If you exclude about 8 million people, which is what they've done, the bottom 10% of our society have literally less than nothing. I mean, they have literally no wealth of any sort. I mean, that's 6 million people. Well, you've got at least 8 million who are going nowhere in our society, and that's a huge number of people.
But, now, at the moment, what did you mean when you said that there are a small number? I mean,
the number of protesting is only tiny relative to 8 million.
Oh, relative to 8 million, yes, but relative to having to police an area, it's still several thousand people.
Yes, that's right. But supposing it becomes 80,000 or 100,000 or 200,000, like you had in the 19th century, we're moving towards a division of wealth which is close to Victorian Britain. Well, when that happened in Victorian Britain, you started to have riots. It wasn't 10, it wasn't 5,000. It was like it was 200,000 or 300,000. You had 6 cities under siege in 1831. I mean, just burning down Nottingham Castle and things. It was a huge disorder. If you exclude a vast number of people, you really create the seeds.
Are you suggesting
of enormous problems.
This could actually happen?
Oh, of course it could get worse. I mean, Nick Clegg actually suggested there were going to be riots if the Tories get in. I don't know if you've seen that on YouTube. It's a great... before the election, Nick Clegg was saying, well, if the Tories get into power, there's a real danger of riots in the streets. Yeah. And it was...
I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the police. Do you think... do you think, amongst, again, with the kids that you work with, are there feelings towards the police that we've seen in London reflected in Glasgow, or is there more of a bond, or at least some more trust?
I mean, we work closely with community safety, people like that, and we do link up from time to time and engage in initiatives with the police and try to break down barriers that way. But what I would like to touch on, Gordon, very quickly, is that in terms of vigilantism, we had that in the 60s in Easter House when I was a kid growing up, with parents trying to break up the gangs and things.
Yeah.
This vigilantism starts off with worthy causes. What's the real concern, particularly in London, is if right-wing extremist groups then attach themselves to the vigilantes.
Look, we're running out of time.
Increase the race war.
All right, what happened in Glasgow? It was parents who were doing
Yeah, in
what?
the 60s, because you have to bear in mind...
This is in the Frankie Vaughan era,
yeah,
right?
that's right, yeah, and you have to bear in mind in the 60s, the provincial housing schemes in Glasgow were built with no amenities that the parents enjoyed in the centre of the town. So that the boredom led to the formation of the gangs.
And then the parents
stepped in, try to prevent it, but it was too late.
All right, look, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed.